The room went silent the moment my father said my brother's name. I remember the sound of the lawyer's pen scratching against paper, the soft hum of the air conditioner, and the way everyone slowly turned to look at Daniel, like he had just won something. My father leaned back in his chair, arms folded proudly. As stated in the will. The lawyer continued, adjusting his glasses. The house, the business, and the majority of the estate will go to Daniel. My brother smiled, not a surprised smile. Not a grateful smile. A victorious one. He didn't even try to hide it. My aunt clapped softly. My father nodded approvingly. Daniel glanced at me for half a second, and the smirk on his face said everything. Of course it was him. It had always been him. The golden son. The future of the family. And me. I was just the quiet one who worked. For 15 years, I helped run my father's construction company. I took the early calls, fixed the broken contracts, negotiated with angry clients, and worked weekends when Daniel decided he was too busy. Busy usually meant golf, or vacations, or simply not showing up. But Dad never saw it that way. To him, Daniel had leadership potential. I had loyalty. The lawyer continued reading numbers and legal phrases that barely registered in my ears. Daniel would get the company, the house, the investment accounts, even Dad's vintage truck. When the lawyer finally closed the folder, he looked around the room politely. That concludes the reading. Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands on the table like a king claiming his throne. Well, he said casually, glancing at me, I guess things worked out the way they were supposed to. A few people chuckled. My father watched me carefully, almost like he was waiting for me to react. Maybe he expected anger, maybe tears, maybe begging, but I simply reached down beside my chair and pulled a thin gray folder onto the table. The soft slide of it across the wood echoed louder than anything else that afternoon. I think we're not quite finished, I said calmly. The lawyer frowned slightly. Excuse me. I pushed the folder toward him. These are financial records from the last 8 years of the company. Daniel rolled his eyes immediately. Oh my God, are you serious right now? The lawyer opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, signed approvals, and one very important document on top, a partnership agreement. My father leaned forward. What is that? I folded my hands. 3 years ago, when the company almost went bankrupt after the Harrison project failed, someone had to cover the debt. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read the document more closely. Daniel shifted in his chair. What debt? I finally looked at him. The one you created. Silence fell across the room. I continued speaking calmly. The Harrison project went over budget by nearly $2 million because someone approved subcontractors that never finished their work. Daniel's voice sharpened. You handled that project too? No, I replied quietly. You signed the contracts. The lawyer flipped to the bank statements. These show a personal loan used to stabilize the company, he said slowly. Yes, I said. A loan that came from my savings, my property, and my personal credit. My father frowned. You never told me that. I tried, I said softly. But you were busy celebrating Daniel landing the deal. Daniel scoffed. So what? You loaned the company money. Big deal. The lawyer cleared his throat. It becomes a very big deal when repayment terms include ownership equity. My father's head snapped toward him. Equity. The lawyer looked up. According to this agreement, signed by both parties, the loan converted into a 51% ownership stake when the company failed to repay within 18 months. Daniel's face went pale. That's not possible. The lawyer slid the signature page across the table. Daniel's name was at the bottom, right beside mine. My father looked between us. You own the company. I stood slowly. Majority owner. I corrected. The room was completely silent now. Daniel looked like someone had knocked the air out of him. You tricked me? He muttered. I shook my head. No, you just didn't read what you signed. 3 years earlier, when the company was drowning in debt, Daniel had been desperate for a quick fix. I offered the loan, and he signed the paperwork in less than 2 minutes. He never asked questions, because he never thought I mattered enough to be careful. I turned to my father. You gave Daniel everything in your will today, I said calmly, but the company stopped being yours a long time ago. The lawyer closed the folder slowly. Legally, it was airtight. Daniel pushed his chair back, furious. This is unbelievable. I picked up the gray folder and tucked it under my arm. You'll still receive whatever Dad left you, I said quietly. But the company, the employees, the future of it. I paused. That's my responsibility now. My father stared at the table. realization finally settling across his face. For years he believed Daniel was the one building the legacy. He never noticed who was actually holding it together. I walked toward the door before anyone could say another word. Behind me, the room was still frozen in stunned silence. And for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't the invisible one. Moment my father said my brother's name. Something inside my chest went completely still. Daniel will inherit the house, the company, and the majority of my estate. The lawyer's voice was calm, professional, almost bored. But Daniel's reaction was the opposite. He leaned back in his chair with a slow smile spreading across his face, like someone who had just been crowned king. Around the table, a few relatives nodded approvingly. My aunt whispered, "Of course," like the outcome had always been obvious. And maybe it had. Daniel was always the favorite, the confident one, the charming one, the one my father proudly introduced to people as the future of the family business. Meanwhile, I was the one actually running it. For 14 years I showed up before sunrise. I handled the payroll crisis, the delayed shipments, the angry contractors, the projects that were falling apart at the seams. When things went wrong, I fixed them. When things went right, Daniel took the credit. And Dad loved him for it. The lawyer finished reading and gently closed the will. That concludes the estate distribution. Daniel stretched his arms across the table like he already owned the room. "Well," he said casually, glancing at me, "I guess that settles it." My father watched me carefully. He was waiting for something. Anger, protest, maybe even begging. Instead, I slowly reached down beside my chair and placed a slim black folder on the table. The soft sound it made sliding across the wood caught everyone's attention. "I think we should look at one more document," I said calmly. Daniel laughed immediately. "Oh, come on," he said. "Don't start drama now." But the lawyer had already picked up the folder. "What is this?" he asked. "Company records?" I replied. My father frowned slightly. "What kind of records?" The lawyer opened it. Inside were copies of financial statements, signed agreements, and transaction reports from the past 5 years. He scanned the first page, then the second. His expression changed. "Interesting," he murmured. Daniel leaned forward impatiently. "What's interesting?" The lawyer looked up. "These documents show that the company took on a private stabilization loan 4 years ago." My father blinked. "A loan? From who?" I folded my hands together. "From me." The room went quiet. Daniel scoffed. "You loaned the company money. So what?" I looked at him calmly. The company needed $1.6 million to survive after the Riverside project collapsed. My father's eyebrows tightened. "That project was Daniel's deal." Daniel snapped. "The market shifted? That wasn't my fault." "No," I said quietly. "But the losses still had to be covered." The lawyer flipped to another page. "This agreement states that if the loan wasn't fully repaid within 24 months, it would convert into ownership equity." Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. So you own a tiny share." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Not exactly." He turned the document so everyone could see it. "According to this contract, the conversion rate grants the lender 55% ownership." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Daniel stared at the paper. "What?" The lawyer tapped the signature line. "It appears both parties signed this agreement." Daniel leaned forward, eyes scanning the page. And then the color drained from his face. Because the signature was his. My father looked at me slowly. "You own the company. Majority owner," I said. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous." I met his eyes evenly. "You signed the agreement." "That was just paperwork to secure the loan?" "Exactly," I replied. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "The terms are very clear. If the loan wasn't repaid, control transferred to the lender." My father's voice dropped. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" I hesitated for a second before answering. "I tried." He looked confused. "When?" 3 years ago," I said quietly. "When you told me to stop complaining and support your brother." The memory hung in the room like a heavy fog. Daniel stood up abruptly. "You planned this?" I shook my head. "No, I protected the company." He pointed at me angrily. "You tricked me!" I stayed calm. "You didn't read the contract." The lawyer closed the folder slowly. "Legally speaking, the ownership transfer occurred 2 years ago, when the repayment deadline passed." Daniel stared at the table like the ground had disappeared under him. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. "All this time," he whispered. I nodded. Yes, the truth was simple. While Daniel was celebrating deals and taking vacations, I was paying off debts, renegotiating contracts, and rebuilding the company piece by piece. The business had survived because someone had to carry it. I stood up from my chair. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Dad, I said gently, you gave Daniel everything in your will today. I picked up the black folder. But the company stopped being yours a long time ago. Daniel's jaw tightened. You think this makes you the boss? I looked at him for a long moment. No, I said calmly. The work already did that. I walked toward the door while the room remained completely silent. Behind me, no one argued. No one stopped me. Because the truth had already settled over the table, like a final verdict. For years, Daniel had been the son my father believed in. But when it came time to decide who actually owned the future, the paperwork had already answered that giving everything to Daniel. The words fell out of my father's mouth so easily, like he was announcing the weather. Sunny, clear, predictable. Around the table, a few relatives nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world. My brother leaned back in his chair, with that same smug smile he'd had since we walked in, like he already knew. Like the entire meeting was just a formality. The lawyer kept reading. The family home, the lake property, the business, and the majority of the estate shall transfer to Daniel. I stopped listening halfway through. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. I'd spent my whole life watching this exact moment happen in slow motion. Daniel was always the chosen one. The confident son. The loud one. The one my father bragged about at every dinner party. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one fixing everything behind the scenes. For 16 years, I worked at our family company. I handled the clients, the payroll disasters, the lawsuits, the contractors who threatened to walk off projects. Daniel. He showed up late, shook hands, took photos, and called himself the face of the brand. And Dad loved that. The lawyer finally closed the document. That concludes the will. Daniel clasped his hands together, smiling like a man who had just won the lottery. Well, he said casually, glancing at me, I guess the future is in good hands. A few people chuckled politely. My father watched me carefully. He was waiting for a reaction. Anger. Jealousy. Maybe a desperate argument. Instead, I slowly reached down beside my chair and placed a thick blue folder on the table. The sound it made sliding across the wood cut straight through the room. Daniel frowned. What's that supposed to be? I looked at the lawyer. Before everyone leaves, I think we should review one more thing. The lawyer hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Financial statements, contracts, emails, transfer records. His eyebrows slowly lifted as he flipped through the pages. Daniel leaned forward impatiently. Seriously? What are we doing right now? The lawyer stopped at a document near the middle. Well, this is interesting. My father leaned closer. What is it? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. It appears the company underwent a financial restructuring 4 years ago. My father frowned. I don't remember approving that. That's because you didn't, I said quietly. Daniel laughed. Oh my God. Is this some kind of jealousy meltdown? I ignored him. 4 years ago, the company nearly collapsed after the Northridge project. My father's face tightened. That project was Daniel's deal. Daniel rolled his eyes. Markets shift. That happens in business. Yes, I said calmly. But the debt that followed didn't disappear. The lawyer turned another page. These records show a private financial bailout. My father looked confused. From who? I met his eyes. From me. Silence spread across the table. Daniel snorted. You, please? The lawyer lifted the contract. The bailout agreement converted to controlling equity if the debt wasn't repaid within 36 months. Daniel shrugged. So what? He owns a few shares. The lawyer slowly shook his head. Not a few. He placed the document flat on the table so everyone could see it. 70%. The room stopped breathing. Daniel leaned forward so fast his chair scraped loudly across the floor. That's impossible. The lawyer pointed to the signature line. Signed, Daniel's name. Clear as day. He grabbed the paper, scanning it like the words might change if he stared hard enough. This was just emergency paperwork. Yes, I said quietly. That you signed without reading. My father looked at me like he was seeing someone new. I nodded. For 3 years now. Daniel's voice cracked with anger. You planned this! You waited for today! I shook my head slowly. No. I waited for you to realize what you signed. The lawyer closed the folder. Legally speaking, the ownership transferred the moment the repayment deadline passed. My father sat back in his chair, stunned. All this time. I finished the thought for him. The company you thought Daniel was running was already mine. Daniel slammed his hands on the table. You think this means you win? I stood up slowly. The room went completely quiet again. I never cared about winning, I said. I picked up the blue folder. I cared about saving the business. My father's voice was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? I looked at him for a long moment. I tried. Memories flashed across his face. The meetings he canceled. The conversations he brushed off. The times he told me to support my brother. I pushed my chair in. You gave Daniel everything today, I said calmly. I slid the folder toward the lawyer. But the one thing that mattered. I looked directly at my brother. Was never yours to give. Daniel said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had no speech, no charm, no confidence left, just silence. I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the room. Behind me, the family that had ignored me for years sat frozen around the table. Because the truth had finally landed. My father had chosen the wrong son, and the paperwork had already made sure it didn't go to Daniel. The sentence hit the room like a quiet explosion. For a second, no one moved. Then my brother leaned back in his chair, slowly smiling, like a man who had just been handed the keys to an empire he barely understood. The lawyer continued reading, but Daniel had already stopped listening. He looked around the table at our relatives, soaking in the attention. My father sat proudly beside him. The golden sun had won again. I stayed quiet. For most of my life, that's exactly what I'd done. Quietly fixing problems, quietly covering mistakes, quietly keeping the family company alive, while Daniel played the role of future CEO. The lawyer finished the final paragraph and closed the folder. That concludes the will. Daniel exhaled like he'd just completed a marathon. Well, he said, stretching his arms across the table. Looks like Dad made the right choice. A few people nodded politely. My aunt smiled at him like he had just graduated from something. My father glanced at me, waiting. I knew that look. He expected disappointment. Maybe anger. Instead, I slowly reached beside my chair and placed a thick brown folder on the table. The sound of it sliding forward cut through the quiet room. Daniel frowned. What's that? I looked at the lawyer. I believe there's something else that should be reviewed before everyone leaves. The lawyer hesitated but opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents carefully organized. Bank transfers, signed approvals, emails, ownership filings. His expression changed almost immediately. Daniel leaned forward impatiently. What is it now? The lawyer flipped another page. Well, this changes things. My father straightened in his chair. What do you mean? I spoke calmly. 5 years ago, when the company nearly collapsed after the Valley Heights contract failed, someone had to step in. Not this again. The lawyer looked up. These documents show a private financial takeover. My father frowned. Takeover. Yes, the lawyer said slowly. The company was technically insolvent at the time. Daniel scoffed. That project just had delays. I looked at him. It lost $4 million. The room went silent. My father turned to Daniel. You told me the losses were temporary. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. They were supposed to be. The lawyer turned another page. It appears the company survived because of a personal financial injection. My father asked the obvious question. From who? I met his eyes. From me? Daniel laughed. Oh, please. But the lawyer lifted a document and placed it on the table. This agreement states that in exchange for covering the debt and stabilizing the company, majority ownership would transfer if repayment wasn't completed within 30 months. Daniel waved dismissively. Fine, so you own a share. The lawyer shook his head. Not a share. He tapped the percentage printed clearly on the page. 65%. Daniel's smile vanished instantly. What? The lawyer slid the paper toward him. Your signature is right there. Daniel grabbed the document, scanning it. And then his face went pale. Because it was true. 5 years earlier, when the company was drowning and desperate for money, he had signed the agreement in a rush. He didn't read it. He didn't ask questions. He just assumed I was helping him. Because in his mind, that's all I had ever been. The helper, the backup, the quiet brother. My father stared at me. I nodded. For 4 years now. Daniel slammed the paper onto the table. This is insane. You signed it. I replied calmly. That was emergency paperwork. Yes. The lawyer folded his hands. And legally binding. My father looked between us, stunned. All this time, the business wasn't even mine. I shook my head gently. Not since the debt conversion triggered. The silence that followed felt heavy. For years my father believed Daniel was carrying the family legacy. But the truth was simpler. Daniel had almost destroyed it, and I had rebuilt it. Quietly, patiently, without anyone noticing. Daniel stood up abruptly. You think this means you beat me? I stood up too. No, I said. I think it means the company survived. He clenched his fists. You planned this moment. I looked at him for a long second. No. Then I glanced around the room at the stunned faces. You all did. I closed the brown folder and picked it up. My father's voice was softer now. Why didn't you tell me? I paused at the end of the table. I tried. Memories flickered across his face. The meetings he canceled. The conversations he dismissed. The times he told me to stop complaining and trust Daniel. I pushed my chair in slowly. Today you gave Daniel everything in your will, I said calmly. I slid the folder toward the lawyer. But the one thing he thought he inherited, I looked directly at my brother, was already gone. Daniel didn't speak. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. No charm, no confidence. Just shock. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the room sat frozen in complete silence. Because after years of being invisible, I had just become the most important person in the